Good morning to you all. I really wish that I could be there in person to kickstart the Insurance Telematics conference, but other duties call. As you may know, the black box is something very close to my heart. I've gone from in the box to on the box and now selling the box. You can tell you've reached the heights of celebrity status when you start addressing insurance conferences about a black box. Seriously though, I've seen the benefits that this technology provides for young drivers, such as myself. I will now pass you over to Cliffy to tell you why it's picking up pace since the Belgians decided you can't rate on gender. Come on then, Mark, keep it crisp.
Gary, as many people may know, is a shareholder in a firm called Ageas, which has been developing its business around telematics and social media. So it's very good of him to do that introduction for me. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to discuss the growth of telematics in a post-gender world. This doesn't sound too exciting on a dull Monday morning when all the trains were messed up. But I do think we are witnessing a potential seismic change in our marketplace. And more of that later. So what will I cover this morning? Firstly, what has the Gender Directive done for telematics? Other factors driving the increase in telematics. What has telematics delivered so far? And where next? Before launching into this, I just want to pose the question, and I will come back to it at the end. Is the connected car becoming a reality? How will this impact the marketplace around us? There's now GPS, GSM, accelerometers. Data is being recorded by smartphones, and you've got OBDs which can be self-fitted into vehicles. This world is moving incredibly quickly. Are we all ready for that? As with most technologies, telematics has followed a typical hype cycle. New technologies often reach a peak of inflated expectations but fall into a trough of disillusionment before entering an enlightenment phase and then gaining momentum. What we've tried to do here is to chart that hype cycle. The early telematics insurance pilots trailed in 2005 and 2006 proved unsuccessful because of difficulties in execution, much higher hardware costs, and more expensive, slower data networks than we have today. When telematics was revisited in 2009-2010, early moves focused on products for young drivers using mileage restrictions and late-night curfews. Now, in the enlightened phase, we see new and different market entrants, including new startups like Insurebox and Ageas, vehicle manufacturers, including GM and Citroën, brokers such as the AA, Hastings, and breakdown companies, as recently announced by the RAC. There's no question that the Gender Directive has invigorated the need for telematics. Gender is only a proxy for driving ability, and if we can monitor driver behaviour by individual risk, gender is null and void. Black box insurance can be up to 30% cheaper than traditional insurance, thus allowing customers essentially to earn back what Brussels took away. Whilst a catalyst, the Gender Directive is not the only reason for the growth in telematics. Other factors have contributed. Firstly, traditional insurance costs have soared in recent years. The cost of technology is significantly reduced. The next generation of drivers are far more inclined to use technology. There is a distinct underwriting advantage. And there is growing political and regulatory pressure around the ability, particularly with young drivers, to be able to obtain motor insurance. And finally, the removal of key rating factors. As a result, the number of providers has increased and the number of customers has increased and continues to grow rapidly. So what has telematics delivered so far? Well, I think it's certainly proven itself in the young driver space and continues to prove itself. Let me share some of our experience that we've had with Ingenie. As well as cheaper premiums, Ingenie have been able to offer quarterly discounts to thousands of young customers who are driving well. Part of our rationale to work with Ingenie was because of their focus on bringing about behavioural change. It doesn't always work. We did have one driver who was clocked every day via the telematics doing 100 miles an hour on the A3. We did point that out to them and did suggest that perhaps this wasn't the best route for them in the future. So working on changing behaviour doesn't always work. However, many customers have gone through their first renewal and been offered premiums which are on average 49% cheaper than where they started. So what about the value for insurers? Undoubtedly, we are learning how to price effectively in this world and how we utilise the indicators of risk and risk-related behaviours. And that does require and has required a different mindsets and different skills and a greater focus on our ability to analyse the data. We do believe that pricing to better reflect risk means improved price competitiveness and longer-term customer loyalty. The positive messages to improve a person's driving, we believe, are a huge benefit. Secondly, it does offer more tightly controlled claims process and allows us to establish liability far earlier in the process. An example of this that we had was a young driver who said that they'd been hit in a supermarket car park. That statement was true, except that when we got the data, it showed that he'd been doing donuts at 10:30 at night and had actually struck his mate, who was also doing donuts in the snow-filled car park. Also, telematics aids the recovery of stolen vehicles. To date, our experience is that 90% have been recovered in under 2 hours. We did have one vehicle that we suspect, having seen the details, wasn't stolen and had been abandoned for whatever reasons, to be found out later in the claim, I'm sure. Thirdly, it allows the customer added value services such as emergency services, vehicle breakdown. And finally, and perhaps importantly, it offers a wealth of data where the value comes from converting that data into competitive advantage. And that's the real challenge for the industry. There is so much data that you can obtain from telematics, but what parts of that data is predictive, what parts of it contribute towards changing behaviour and therefore improving risk. And that will be a continuing challenge for the industry. I do feel, interestingly enough, I do feel that telematics is actually one of the few areas that could create a perfect virtuous circle. Better drivers through behavioural awareness and behavioural change leads to safer roads for us all, which leads to cheaper insurance for drivers and then improved underwriting performance for insurers, we hope. And certainly, I have to say, in our experience so far, we are seeing a definite improvement in underwriting performance through the behavioural changes, albeit it is early days. But I do think it's interesting to see that actually telematics, the benefits it creates is a win line for all parties. And what about consumers? We hear a lot of comment that's been made around consumers are concerned about, is it Big Brother? They're not yet convinced fully. I think people are more convinced in the young driver space, particularly where it is parents or grandparents who are probably paying the premium and actually for taking the policy out. For the mass market and the older market, we've got work to do. And I think there's work to do, one, dispelling the myth around Big Brother, but secondly, that we convince people that their data is safe. And we've got a long way to go. Clearly, they also need to see that there is a premium benefit in doing and taking out or fitting some sort of telematic device. Incidentally, I sit on the ABI working party for telematics, and the vehicle manufacturers don't call it telematics, they call it intelligent transport systems. So we know we'll stick to telematics today. So where next? Now, the logic says, okay, we can now take telematics, we'll extend that into the mass market and the affluent markets. The days of the box might be numbered. You'll have OBD, you'll have smartphones, and all of that is very logical and very boring. The reality is OBD can only be fitted in 60% of the cars in the UK. It's not like the States, where there is a common standard for fitting such devices. That presents a challenge. And also smartphone technology, whilst clearly is attractive, in that there's probably not many of us here who haven't got a smartphone, the reality is it's still in its early stages of development. Just to give you the example, you may have heard the story of the person who was on the train and his smartphone app reported that he was travelling at 100 miles an hour, which was true, back to his black box provider. So there are glitches still with the use of smartphone. And if anything at the moment, I think smartphone is more around marketing. Some people see this as a sort of controversial statement, so be it. Now, all this, but now I think this is the scary bit. Telematics embraces a number of interested parties in the value chain, including vehicle manufacturers, breakdown companies, etc. So let me paint a picture of what the world could look like. Let's use the example of a breakdown firm. Breakdown firm could give a free OBD device to all their customers. This means they can monitor when that customer has an accident or when there is something wrong with the car. This means they can be first on the scene. This means they could send vehicles to their own repairer network. This means the insurer, who has invested heavily in their claims network, just receives a bill, game, set and match. This could potentially, this is where I think we've got to think about telematics and where it goes. This could be a huge disruptor to, frankly, an industry that is relatively traditional. Because that example could equally be a vehicle manufacturer. And essentially, the role that insurers play, particularly in the claims process, could be cut out at a stroke. Now, for the vehicle manufacturers and others, they do have concerns over the ownership of data. And clearly want the data to be owned by the individual. It is not a great sales pitch for the police to come to the vehicle manufacturer to ask for the data and for their client to be locked up. That is not a great sales pitch. If the customer owns the data, then they can stand away from that. So there are some issues, and they have had problems in the States. But I do believe this is why I do think that telematics has the potential to be a huge seismic change in our business, because it will allow other players in the value chain to grab space that at the moment is dominated by traditional processes. And that's what scares me. And I think we've got to ask ourselves, are we ready to deal with that? So I think that's the exciting and scary thing about telematics. Let me just talk briefly about the ABI. I think it is clear we do need to create a set of minimum standards. I'm involved in a group that's working with the vehicle manufacturers to try and do that, involving Polaris and Thatcham. And there is a good practice guide that we're just about to produce to really trying to get everybody on the same playing field. The FSA have taken a look at telematics. They were very concerned about unintended consequences, such as curfew products. So if the curfew was 10 o'clock and the claim was 10:15, would you turn the claim down, was one of the questions that they asked. They have, at the moment, they are minded, we believe, to not to do a thematic review on telematics, subject to the industry agreeing with the good practice guide. We think that's a good place for us to be in the early days of this development, and we're pushing to get that guide agreed and out to everybody in the market. And we've consulted with, clearly, not just insurers, but everyone involved in the value chain. The EU, bless them, there is talk that by 2020, telematics or intelligent transport systems will be a standard fit in most new cars. The reality is, even if every new car had some form of telematics, it would take 10 to 15 years to go through the car park. So that is not a short-term win by any stretch of the imagination. So when people talk about the black box will be obsolete, I'm sure it will, but I probably won't be around to see that happen. So there is some time before that actually runs through the whole of the UK car park. I want to just finish with some questions. Firstly, is your business model adequate to cope with this change? I think we have to ask ourselves that our value chain could potentially be threatened. Have we got the speed of process to be able to deal with this? Have your competitors changed, or will they change? And are you ready for, linked to that, a social media world? I use an example, and it's against ourselves, but it's an example of that really helped to focus our minds on new world to an extent. We got pricing through a real-time pricing mechanism wrong. And somebody took out a policy and tweeted that what a great deal this was. And now, normally in old world, 4 days later, someone would have spotted it and we'd have sold 3 policies and we'd have fixed it. In 2 hours, we sold 150 policies, and people tweeting each other like mad that you know, they got this price, and that was an example of where we were having to fix the process considerably quicker than we would perhaps have done in the past. And that's a small example, but one I think that is relevant. Telematics is, I believe, here to stay. The connected driver is here now. The article I put up at the outset was from the FT in February of this year. I think this presents a bigger threat to our value chain as insurers than we realise. I think it presents a great opportunity for us to get on the front foot with both the government and the regulator around the price of motor insurance, but also how we're driving behavioural change through the use of the data. I hope my session has given you some food for thought. I know you're going to go into great detail throughout the rest of today on areas of pricing and marketing and technology. And I know you're going to have a very interesting, exciting day. Sorry I can't be with you for the rest of the day, but as I say, I hope I've given you some food for thought, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can you please raise your hand, give us your name and where you come from, and wait for the microphone to come. Let's just stick it right up in the air, otherwise I won't be able to see it. Okay, well, I've got one obvious one, I think, for me, which is you talk about the ABI. Can you give me some idea of the direction on the ownership of data? Because I think that is the crucial issue.
I think the view is that the data is ultimately owned by the customer. I think there has to be some view on how we define what that data means. So as an example, if it was deemed that under data protection that you had to send all the telematic data to an individual, you would probably crash every PC in the land. And that's why the creation of, we think, minimum standards is important. But ultimately, and I think, and I know that the vehicle manufacturers was thinking the same way, that the customer owns the data and then they decide who can access that data and what it's used for with their agreement.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Just at the front, sorry, get the microphone.
Mark, it's one about behaviour. So, thank you. So, if you argue that the people who are going to be early adopters of telematics might be those who see an advantage for themselves, and therefore they may be considered to be the safer drivers, if their premiums are going to reduce, I don't necessarily follow the logic myself, but I'm interested in your views. If their premiums reduce and that critical mass becomes bigger, but they are early adopters who have effectively a lower loss ratio, what does that effectively potentially mean from an insurer's perspective of those people who aren't on telematics, but that section of society may have been subsidising those overall premiums and loss ratios?
I think you have to look at it, you have to measure it by the risk and what we know. What telematics says is we will know more, and therefore why wouldn't you therefore charge a premium that is, you know, commensurate with the risk? Other people may not choose to take that, that's fine, and we'll charge a premium based on what we perceive the risk is against those factors that we know. I don't see that as any real change. I think that the concept of getting people to recognise, and there's a long way to go on this, that actually if you want to improve your driving, this is the way to take out your insurance. And there are a lot of people out there. It's interesting that within Ingenie they run almost a little bit of a league table that customers can see. It's amazing how that generates a fair amount of the people who want to get better and improve and be seen to be, you know, better than their peers in how much they've improved. Not for everybody. The example I used earlier of the guy who drove to work every day and hit a ton. Telematics isn't going to work for that person. But I do think there's a lot of people out there in mass market and above. I mean, if you look at, I think Insure the Box say that their average customer is 34, average age. We've been piloting specifically in the 17 to 25-year-old. And we do see that a lot of people with that desire to change behaviour therefore reduce their premium. And also the other bit is around, particularly in that age group, is around fraud as well. People talk about, well, why would you do box fitting? Actually, box fitting is part of the QA process. So you'll be amazed the number of things the box fitter spots, like modifications that you weren't told about. I think in one case there was a certain bag of drugs that were in the car and stuff like that. So it was a bit of a clue. So it is that whole process. And I think you'll have different technologies for different age groups. I think as you get into the mass market, I do think the smartphone, I do think the OBD device will be the more prevalent, rather than the fitting of a black box. But with young drivers, I still think fitting of a black box has a lot of relevance.
Okay. Yes, sorry, another one at the front. Sorry, the microphone. Can you just say your name and where you're from, please?
Hi, it's Krista McCulloch from RSA. So if we're looking at telematics from sort of a pricing and underwriting point of view, what do you think the advantages could be, and so where do you see it going in terms of sort of claims proposition from an insurer point of view?
I think we've got to be able to it's how we use the data positively. So from an underwriting view, how can we use the data to ensure it's predictive? So what is it telling us? There is so much data, and we're all in the process of sifting through that to understand what has more relevance. As far as the claims process, I think it's that ability to be, how do you target a proposition in the same way as the example I talked about, the breakdown firm, and that example is probably closer to reality than people think, is how do we ensure that we're the first on the scene of the accident supporting the individual? How do we ensure that, you know, we've got a proposition that is therefore positive? How do we allows us to clear up liability issues quicker? You know, that's it. So I think those are the key advantages we should be stressing, not that the negatives of, well, if you don't quite tell us the truth, we'll find out. It's the positive elements of the claims process that we should be redesigning around these processes and emphasising.
Okay, thank you. I think our time's up. I'll ask one quick question as we're on claims. And someone tweeted me this question over the weekend, and it's really, can telematics help with regard to whiplash claims and the 1,500 of those a day? You may not know the answer.
I think the quick answer is it can give information about speed of impact. Will it deal with the whiplash problem? I don't think so. And the reason I say that, the big issue is until we get either a process that they have in Germany, where there is a speed limit below which there is no whiplash claims, or we get an independent process that isn't relying on a GP. That opportunity is going to be there, and then you couple that with the judiciary system that in whiplash claims generally find in favour of the individual against a big bag insurance company. We've got to keep pushing for that judiciary reform and keep pushing to get, you know, that whiplash. And I think the government now are taking that seriously. I think they do recognise there is an issue, and that issue is reflected in the price, the premiums people pay. But it's a long haul.
Okay, with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to Mark.